Be garnering the majority of the headlines, but there is still a pandemic raging. The U.S. just marked 1 million COVID dead this week, and 1/3 of the world remains unvaccinated. And those two crises, the pandemic and the war, are lighting a fire under a growing global economic crisis. So what is to be done? Joining me now here in London is Zanny Minton Beddoes, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and Ian Bremmer is with us from New York. He's the president of the Eurasia Group and the author of a terrific new book, The Power of Crisis, How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. Ian, let me start with you, and let me ask you a question about crises, since you are now a world expert on crises. Why is it that the Russia-Ukraine crisis or 9/11, these sort of geopolitical crises trigger huge global responses, but this enormous crisis of the pandemic, 1 million dead in the United States, what is it, 5 million dead around the world, it hasn't really gotten us to change much of anything. What do you think explains that?
Probably 15 million, according to the CDC, but your point is all the stronger. Look, in the case of the Russia crisis, the information space is in the West completely all together. They're with Zelensky, they're with Ukraine, and that certainly makes a difference in terms of being able to compel Western response. And secondly, over time, the level of concern about the crisis only grew. I mean, if the Russians had actually taken Kiev in the first few days and had ousted Zelensky, it would have been much less of a problem, frankly, and you wouldn't have seen Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and you wouldn't have seen the same level of support for the Ukrainians or the sanctions. In the case of the pandemic, in the early days, Fauci was lionized, the CDC, great concern, but in relatively short order, you politicized the crisis and you also lost the same level of concern. Once you had therapeutics, once you had a vaccine, suddenly it became less of a concern for everyone together, and you actually lost that momentum. What you need, Fareed, is what I call in the book a Goldilocks crisis. You don't want it to be so big that you curl into a ball in the corner and wait for the world to end, but it can't be so small that you can be politically divided and not inconvenience yourself. Russia, Ukraine is a Goldilocks crisis, and frankly, the pandemic is not.
Zanny, let me ask you, first, you agree that with the Goldilocks crisis idea, but more importantly, it may be a Goldilocks crisis in the sense that it's not so big that it overwhelms, and there is a response to it, but it does feel like it has follow-on crises, energy crisis, economic crisis. Europe is almost certainly going to go into recession, food crisis. How bad are these follow-on crises that are going to come out of the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
So I think they're pretty big. I mean, I like Ian's idea of a Goldilocks crisis. You kind of want a Goldilocks everything. You want a Goldilocks economy, you want a Goldilocks, global financial system. You want everything not to be too hot and not to be too cold. But I actually think Ukraine is a huge reshaping of the global geopolitical order, and we can talk about that. And that will have very, very big consequences. We're obviously seeing them in the likely expansion of NATO now. But there are very big immediate crises coming on top of that. And the one that really worries me right now is the global food crisis. And this, I think, is something that is just coming onto the agenda. It is going to be dominating, I predict, the conversation in the next few months. And let me just tell you why. Long before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, 2022 was already set to be one of the most dangerous and worst food crises in the post-war period. We've had a lot of droughts around the world. Latin America has had 2 years running of very poor harvests. North Africa, very poor harvest. The US harvest doesn't look so great, the early predictions.
And this is all mostly climate.
This was climate related, yeah. Absolutely. And so global grain stocks were already very low before Vladimir Putin invaded. Now, Ukraine and Russia between them, it's hard to exaggerate how important these countries are. They are 30% of globally traded wheat. They are equally big proportions of barley, corn, all manner of other things. 80% of sunflower oil, which is a big, edible oil. If you put all of it together, I think it's something like 12% of global calories traded come from these two countries. And what you've seen in the last few weeks is essentially a dramatic reduction both because Ukraine has been blockaded, as you know, the ports of Odessa by the Russians. They've been mined. They can't get any exports out. That means all of the harvest from last year that hadn't already been exported can't get out. There have been, many farms have been hit by Russian shelling, Russian ordnance, so the likely production is going to be lower. Russia's not going to be able to export as much. And then just to add to this, both countries, but particularly Russia, are huge sources of energy and inputs for fertilizer, which means that next year's harvest around the world, Brazil gets a ton of its fertilizer inputs from Russia. All of this stuff is going to be hit. And people who are in this world are increasingly alarmed that we are going to be facing the biggest food crisis since the First World War, not just in recent decades. It's a huge, huge deal. And so I think that is not, to use Ian's terminology, a Goldilocks crisis.
So, Ian, this raises an interesting problem. We have found a kind of military political response to the Russian-Ukraine crisis. But do we have anything near the kind of global coordination, the kind of sense of a humanitarian crisis to deal with the crisis Zanny's talking about?
Well, we don't even have a global response to the Russia crisis because it's about advanced industrial democracies. Poorer countries, middle-income countries around the world are not with the United States, not democracies versus autocracies. But the West is together, and that matters. Will the West be together on the global food crisis? I agree completely with Zanny about the order of magnitude of concern here. But I also fear that the Western response to global food crisis is going to be akin to where we were on climate 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is a big deal. We really should worry about it, but it's mostly about poorer people in poorer countries. In the United States and Europe, we'll have enough to do things for ourselves. And how much do we care about Sri Lanka or Tunisia or Egypt or Lebanon or some of the countries that are really going to be under the gun here, have been for the last 2 years with the pandemic, and now even worse? I'm concerned that the West does not feel that this is an urgent crisis for them, and as a consequence, this is likely to get much worse before it gets better for the average person. And there'll be hundreds of millions of people that are going to be seriously food stressed over the coming 2 years minimum because of the level of disruption from Russia and Ukraine and the supply chain knock-on that we see from both the direct foodstuffs, from fertilizers, and from global energy.
All right, we are going to have to take a break. When we come back, we'll get back to this, but also China, COVID, economic growth, all that when we come back. For the worst food crisis since the First World War, so basically in almost 100 years. What to do about it?
Well, I think the most important thing is to get the world together to try and alleviate the things that can be alleviated. The quick things are, can you get the port of Odessa opened? That will get the stuff that is currently, the grains that are currently in Ukraine out. Right now, that's impossible. The Ukrainians have mined it because they're worried about, well, the Russians are trying to shell it. But that is a consequence of the Russian action. And I think there is a chance.
That's not sanctions, in other words.
It's not sanctions. And I think there's a chance as a result to change the narrative, because much of the narrative in the global south, if you will, is a narrative that they are being hit by a war that has nothing to do with them and the sanctions that the West has imposed. Russia has been very good at politicizing this narrative in the global south. But in fact, a lot of this has not to do with the sanctions. It has to do with Russian actions. And I think if the West, if the United States is clever about it, it can bring countries on board, whether it's the South Africas, whether it's the Brazils. Even India can be brought in to try and put pressure or to come up with a plan to get these supplies out, because they are the biggest losers, North African countries, Turkey. But unfortunately, right now, we see that actually we're going in the opposite direction. India, as you know, just yesterday imposed an export ban on wheat, and many people had been relying. India has a lot of stocks right now. They've been relying on India to supply the global wheat market. So right now it looks as though we're going in the opposite direction, that of beggar thy neighbor, protectionism, each country banning exports, which would really mean we end up in a global disaster. But if you can bring countries on board to find a way, and it will be hard, to find a way to get the grain that is in these countries, particularly in Ukraine, out, then I think there is some way, perhaps not just of alleviating the crisis, but of giving a sense that the global south has a stake in this, which is really, really important.
Ian, I got to ask you.
I want to jump in on that.
Yeah, do it quickly, because I got to ask you about China and Chinese economic growth, which seems veering, very, very low because of the insistence on zero COVID.
Absolutely true. The quick point I wanted to make is so much of the narrative we've heard from the developing world is, you care about Ukraine because they're European, because they're white, 6 million refugees. You didn't care about the Syrians. You don't care about Yemen or Afghanistan. The reality is this is a vastly more important conflict for the developing world because of the interdependence of the global economy. They should care more about Russia, Ukraine. They should be more invested precisely because this is going to hurt them in a way that Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan really didn't. And the world isn't there today. We have to spread that narrative. But China, this is a huge problem. This is the second largest economy in the world. And they were the most effective in responding to COVID once they admitted that COVID existed for the first year. They're the only ones that had growth, but they've stuck with it. And they've stuck with the same exact zero COVID policy when they don't have the vaccines, when they don't have the therapeutics. And now that's really causing more supply chain challenges on top of everything we've just been discussing. And by the way, this is fixable. The fact is that the single greatest excess commodity we have in the world right now, it's not energy, it's not food, it's not fertilizer, it's mRNA vaccines for COVID. We can't get them in the arms of Africans because we don't have the infrastructure on the ground. The Chinese do, but they refuse to accept international coordination and help because they're so angry at the way they were blamed, and they're so angry about the way that COVID has gone through the rest of the world while the Chinese locked it down. As a consequence, we are all suffering. We can't coordinate on COVID.
Thoughts on China's, if it's aiming for zero COVID, it appears to be getting zero economic growth. That's an exaggeration, but how bad is that?
I think it's pretty bad. And I think it is clearly, you cannot have zero COVID. This is a strategy that in the long run cannot work. But unfortunately, in a year where Xi Jinping wants to become, at the National Party Congress later this year, effectively ruler for life, I think we're getting to the stage where no one dares tell him. No one dares say this is not going to work. And if you mix that, or if you add to that to the clampdown on tech that he did in the last few months, I'm increasingly worried that China is moving to a sort of slightly erratic, autocratic, ultra-personal autocratic system of government. And so I'm deeply worried about China. But just to end on a really good note, and particularly to you, Fareed, I've just been in India, and I am much more upbeat in India. Our cover story this week in India is they could blow it. The Modi government could blow it. But India has the ingredients, both luck, because of China's travails and because the world wants an alternative supplier, because they've benefited from their huge investment in digital tech, because of a lot of things that are going right for them. I'm very, very upbeat on the potential for India. This year it's going to be the fastest growing economy in the world, and it could be for the next 10 years if they play things right.
120 degrees Fahrenheit in Delhi right now, Fareed. I don't know.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that, and I'm going to tell people to read the current issue of The Economist and buy Ian Bremmer's new book, or read it if you can find a way to do that without buying it, but I think Ian would like you to buy it. Next on GPS, Inside Putin's Mind. I'm going to take you there. It's the title of my latest special, which premieres tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. When we come back, you'll get a sneak peek.